New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been the celebrity leader of the international left. I mean, never mind what she's actually doing to her country, her economy, race relations there. Just look at her style, look at her smile, look at her youth, her wokeness. In fact, the ABC's new host of its, marquee 7:30 program, Sarah Ferguson, she's supposedly a Rottweiler in interviews, right? Snap, 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 snap. She simpered all over Ardern when she interviewed the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago. Get a bucket, because check what I'm going to show you.
That was quite a speech that you gave a couple of months ago to this year's graduates at Harvard University.
Sure. I would just point out our relatively low levels of debt, historically low unemployment and good solid GDP growth. But apart from that, we are experiencing CPI increases.
Thank you very much, Tourism New Zealand. But I just want to talk about the phenomenon of Jacinda Ardern. It's very unusual for a Prime Minister of a small Pacific country to become a global celebrity. How do you explain the sustained interest in you?
Tell me how wonderful you are. How do you manage it? I mean, seriously. But there are signs that the Jacinda Ardern gloss is sure wearing off fast back home in New Zealand. Joining me is Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, to tell us what you wouldn't have learned from the 7:30. Dr. Hartwich, thank you for your time. In Australia, we think we've got a huge problem with inflation, 5.1%. We're really worried. New Zealand's inflation is not 5.1%, it's 7.3%. Why is that?
You're right, Andrew. It's 7.3, and that's just the official figure. It would have been probably 7.8 or maybe 8% had the government not delivered a temporary tax cut for fuel. So we are now looking at an inflation scenario for New Zealand, which is among the highest in the world. And you asked, why is that? Well, two factors. One, the government is spending a lot, and it has actually spent a lot more since COVID. But the other factor, probably the even bigger factor, is our Reserve Bank, because over the last couple of years, the Reserve Bank has more than tripled its monetary base from a level of just under 15 billion New Zealand dollars in February 2020 to about 53, 54 billion dollars today. So this is quite an aggressive stance by our Reserve Bank. We initially had a quantitative easing program, that is money printing, of up to 100 billion. They stopped midway through because they could already see that they're overstimulating the economy. But they're still stimulating the banks. They are still doing a so-called funding for lending program. And that means they're flooding markets with cash. That cash is trickling through the economy. And that's why we have this inflation in New Zealand.
It sounds like our Reserve Bank on steroids, the way you describe it. And how's the economy travelling? I mentioned the inflation rate. What other factors are you seeing, data that you're seeing that suggests that you might be in a bit of trouble there?
Well, if you listen to our government, they will tell you that we are currently looking at an economy in full employment because our unemployment rate is very low. We have 3.3% unemployment. However, things are not as good as they seem, because actually what you're looking at here is a crippled labor market, because what we have done is actually we have reduced the labor supply because we are no longer letting people into the country. Well, it's just starting now after 2 years of being a hermit kingdom. But at the same time, we have also reduced the labor supply domestically because we are no longer actually forcing beneficiaries, job seekers back into the labor market. And on top of all of that, of course, the government is crowding out the labor market by employing more people. So over the last 5 years, we have seen a growth in public sector employment of more than 50,000 people. And if you put all of these factors together, basically what you have is you have an economy that looks like in full employment, but actually it is a very distorted labor market. It doesn't look good. And of course, we now have a phenomenon where migrants, potential migrants, no longer want to come to New Zealand because we make it very hard for migrants to even get their visas processed, let alone get permanent residence in New Zealand. So they actually might be better off moving to Australia if you're a nurse, for example, than trying to settle in New Zealand. At the same time, we had an opinion poll revealing just a couple of weeks ago that now 1 in 5 New Zealanders are considering leaving the country, migrating, especially to Australia. So currently we're looking at 200,000 New Zealanders who already say they've made the decision, they want to leave the country, and about 1 million New Zealanders who are currently considering leaving the country. So you can tell, just looking at these figures, that something is not quite right in New Zealand.
Well, I find it absolutely astonishing that Jacinda Ardern hires 50,000 more public servants, taking workers away from more productive jobs. Plus, you've still got the number of people on benefits increasing, and so's the number of people on job seeker support. It's so astonishing. And how's it being reflected in the polls?
Well, if you look at the polls for the first time actually in years, a majority of New Zealanders now say that the country is traveling in the wrong direction. Actually, during the first COVID lockdown in March 2020, 77% of New Zealanders said the country is going in the right direction, believe it or not. That has gone down to just 36%, and now 50% of New Zealanders say this country is traveling in the wrong direction for a number of reasons. I mean, you've mentioned the economy, but there are other issues as well. There is the debate over core governance, which basically means giving Maori more rights or different rights. And so New Zealanders feel that something is brewing up in this country, and they're increasingly unhappy. And if you look at the polls, it is reflected in the most recent polls. We had majorities for the opposition. We still have about 14 months to go to next year's election, but the way the country is traveling with the economic crisis on the horizon and building up, the next year's election is the opposition's to lose.
Yes, well, I think that the race politics, which we've covered a few times, you won't find a coverage of that in the ABC, is very seriously worrying. Oliver Hartwich, thank you so much indeed for your time.